Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of our podcast. We are Alien Astrobiology Lessons for an Interdisciplinary Education Network. I am Ariel. I am a biomedical sciences and data science double major at Arizona State University, and I'm so excited to be here with Dr. Ximena Bernal of Purdue University. Her research lab focuses on how natural enemies shape animal communication systems and on human impacts on communication networks, such as habitat fragmentation, traffic noise, and more. Her research lab investigates frogs and toads and their enemies, exploring signaling function evolution and trophic networks. One major commitment of Dr. Bernal's lab is broadening participation in science, particularly with students from marginalized groups. We are so excited to welcome Ximena to the podcast today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate this kind invitation. I'm excited to learn more about this club and what you do.
Thank you so much. So we can get right into the questions. The first question is just drawing on what your lab does. What is a communication system? Is it internal to a species, or does it cover whole ecosystems? And if anybody is unfamiliar with these terms, an ecosystem is sort of just like, a general sort of bubble of animals and plants and environments and interactions between living things.
Yeah, well, that is a really good question. And when you think about it, you'll think that communication is easy to define. However, we have many different definitions of animal communication. And even traditionally, communication is just defined as a signaler that produces, of course, a signal that transmits information through the environment to a receiver. But people question, what about manipulation? Is that communication? Like if you're doing something that creates a response that is not a benefit from the two, is that communication? Does communication have to be plus for the two involved? So we could have a long conversation about it, but in general, we assume that is information that is transmitted. Traditionally, textbooks define it as a dyadic interaction, two individuals only, and that's where the communication network comes into place. Because when you look at nature, we realize that even though communication at its core is between two individuals, they are surrounded by a variety of other organisms, sometimes from the same species, and more interesting to me, from different species that are paying attention to these exchanges of information to exploit them. So the communication network is basically any individual that is connected to that signal.
Wow, that's so cool. Yeah, the idea of like eavesdropping organisms, the manipulation of the communication. That's also cool just when we think about space exploration. One concern is sometimes if we send a signal out there to potential, extraterrestrial companions in the universe, maybe the group that is going to like directly receive our signal, or if we eventually start up a communication with the group, they're benevolent, but someone malevolent could be watching or eavesdropping and decide that we're a threat or we need to be wiped out or something, which is definitely something that a lot of science fiction authors have, focused on because it's really scary. But yeah, just in general.
Yeah, you can run with that idea, but also if you think about it, you could also think about us being the eavesdroppers. Mm-hmm. As we put all these devices out there, we're trying to pick up on these signals, even if they're not intended to us, to try to get glimpses of whether there's life elsewhere.
You're so right.
We are also eavesdropping.
Yeah, no, you're so right. Totally. Cool. Now we have another label for ourselves as humans. Eavesdroppers of the universe.
I love that.
Okay, so the next question is, how do natural enemies shape communication systems?
That is an awesome question. That's actually what I study, and we've been looking at this, and what we think is that they're really important. And when you look at life right now and signalers and signals, what we see is that there's been strong selection for signals so the intended receivers, the ones that the signalers target, they impose selection to make them louder, more conspicuous, easier to detect. But that's when the eavesdroppers come into place. Because oftentimes signalers don't want their signals to be exploited, especially by enemies. And by enemies, we mean predators, parasites. So for instance, I study frogs. So frogs, the male frogs call, and they're calling to attract their mate, a female. But when they produce these signals, females want louder, longer, very extravagant and conspicuous ornamented signals. But yet the enemies also find those more attractive and easier to detect. So what we see is that these signals are the interface on trying to reach the target signal, the signal receiver, but trying to avoid exploitation by disruptors, have evolved all this variety of strategies. Mm-hmm. So we think that disruptors have shaped how signals look like, so making them less conspicuous, sometimes a little sneaky, but also signalers' behaviors. So if a signaler perceives that there's risk of disrupting, they may produce less signals, make it softer, and in some cases even change to a different modality that is less if conspicuous to the enemy. So we see that over the life of an individual, but also over evolutionary time. And we have amazing examples of organisms that have even lost their signal because the disruptors are imposing such strong pressure. And we evolve new ones that are more subtle and less easier to detect for the disruptor. So we think that enemies really shape the signals that are used, how they are used, and the signaling behaviors.
Wow, yeah, that's a good example too of evolutionary trade-offs where, you know, the organisms would like their signals to be conspicuous for mates, but it just leads to more predation possibly. So that's cool, because in any case, whenever we look at what potential evolutionary paths could look like for any organism that we're interested in, or if we're reverse engineering their evolution, we do have to think about trade-offs. That's like a big thing in evolution. I took an evolution class last semester, so I'm like thinking about it now. But absolutely something that's so important to think about when we are considering potential aliens on different worlds. There are, you know, multiple organisms interacting, like you said, like a dyadic communication system that just spreads throughout an ecosystem, throughout a world, and can completely shape how different organisms evolve. And so we could have entirely wrong ideas about what organisms could look like or what they could be because we're so like anthropocentric or human focused, just being humans, just, you know, it's just an internal bias that we have. But we have to think about like every possible route, and involved in that are considerations of trade-offs and communication and stuff like that. So that's really important.
I agree, and I think that it's a good reminder of the complexity of life, at least on Earth, and we will hope that this expands. But also, what we have learned is that when we only look at communication from a traditional perspective with two parties involved, we miss and misunderstand the whole picture. So, for instance, one of my favorite examples is call synchronization. So there are frogs that call exactly at the same time, like tuk tuk. And there are very few out of the almost 8,000 species of frogs, probably, well, we don't know. We're learning more about it, but we think that not that many do it, maybe 20 species more, where the number is growing. But it's puzzling. And when we were studying this at first without taking into account the enemies, we didn't understand why they will call at the same time, because if the purpose is to communicate, to expect them, and what we see is that we take turns, and frogs do that. So like one of the species I work with, males do toon, they wait, and they're one toon. Yeah. So they're alternating because this increases the chances that the signal will make it to the receiver, the target receiver. Mm-hmm. So the fact that they were synchronizing was a puzzle for a long time. And then come the enemies. But what we learn is that when you look at the bats that are eavesdropping on these frogs, the mosquitoes that are eavesdropping on these frogs, this call synchronization is a way to basically make their job harder. So now we understand that they're synchronizing to reduce their chances of being attacked by their enemies. But it has also had the consequences of releasing females. So females now have this ability that they are not full, and they're really good at detecting signals that are synchronized. And we're just starting to understand how the females do it, even though everybody else is tricked.
Wow. Okay, so that's an example of like a evolutionary arms race, which I know that. So I first saw Dr. Bernal at a conference, the Animal Behavior Society conference last summer, and one of the talks was on the evolutionary arms race between bats and moths, in which each organism just pushed the other to become more evolutionary advanced in some way so that they could evade predation or be able to actually eat the other animal. So that's kind of like that, where like the females are, you know, getting better at detecting signals that are maybe more diffused, so that for the purpose of like making sure that the enemies don't get to the frogs.
They do it to find a mate, and the males are navigating this, trying to become still attractive to females, but reduce their attractiveness to the enemies. Cool. Being a male frog is hard.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Very perilous lifestyle, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So the next question is, what are some of the most measurable ways that humans have impacted animal communication networks?
That we are continuing to learn, but we know that we are impacting communication networks in many ways. So we know that on one hand, we may filter out some species. So if it's a very noisy environment, so I mostly work on sensory pollutants. So I'm interested in those because we know that we humans impact clearly many species by changing their habitat. So habitat destruction is the main filter. But even for species that can survive in modified habitats, we change the conditions. We make them noisier. We start adding light at night, artificial light at night.
Yeah.
So all of these can change the patterns, especially for animals that communicate using acoustic signals, communicate at night, like the frogs. But also birds that also use signals, and some insects. And we know that many animals are filter out, that they cannot handle it, but they want to survive in these outer environments, are adjusting their signals. So sometimes they shift when they call. Maybe they don't call during rush hour. They wake up earlier and call earlier or later. We also know that their signals are changing, maybe increasing in frequency. So they are above the background noise level. So they reduce acoustic interference. And we also know that sometimes they basically move to quiet environments if they can. So what we're learning right now is that they are changing. Not everybody can change. And what we're continuing to understand is how, for instance, multiple pollutants affect them. So we know sound of like traffic noise affect them. We know artificial light at night affects them. And like something that we're studying in the lab is how do they two come together? And what about like the lights of a car passing versus just a highway that is constantly on?
Right.
Do the frogs get habituated, or how do they respond?
Wow, yeah. I mean, it's always important to remember how much of an impact we have on other like ecosystems and other organisms within those ecosystems. And for anybody who has listened to a couple of previous episodes of the podcast, and just to let you know, Dr. Bernal, we interviewed somebody who works with spiders and specifically focuses on artificial light at night and how it affects their molting and their survival, which is super interesting. And also it's pretty sad to me that, you know, all this artificial light at night is so impactful to these organisms, often in a negative way. So it's interesting to just think about how we can do better about keeping our lights yellow, or, you know, keeping things darker.
I agree. And for me, one of the most interesting things and a challenge is that we don't have a recipe that we can say, okay, all the species are affected and all the species do this. So the responses are very species specific. So we see, for instance, when we look at Purdue is in Indiana, and we have been studying the frogs in the West Lafayette area, and we have studied some, and we're like, okay, how does this species respond to traffic noise? What about light? What about the two together? And what we're finding is that for some species, the noise is really bad. And they stop calling, they reduce their calling, which reduces their mating. Other ones don't care much about the noise. They keep calling. I'm like, oh, that's great. But then they are sensitive to light.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no. And then when you add them together, you're like, no, what is happening? So every species is unique and responds in different kind of ways. So what we're trying to understand now is general patterns. Are there strategies that will benefit most species that are confronted with this challenge?
Wow. Yeah. That's tough. That's why we need people like you who are sort of like trailblazing the path toward better conservation efforts and just understanding other organisms, which is what we need to do if we're going to, like, you know, go out into the universe and look for, you know, extraterrestrial life. We need to be very respectful of that life and understand that we're not the only ones in this, you know, cosmic home. I'm just going to, there's one question that I think is especially important, so I'm just going to make sure that we get to it. You and your lab are interested in science communication. What is the best way that we can present science to the broader public?
Yeah, I feel that that is our duty and responsibility as scientists. Like, oftentimes we are paid by taxpayer dollars. So not only that, but also because that's why we build knowledge, to share it with our communities and for people to get a better understanding of the world. So we're highly committed to communicate our science, and we do it from different scales. Like we, of course, do traditional outreach, going to K-12 schools and doing activities, because I feel that our duty is also to help ignite those curious young minds and get them to be passionate about and curious about nature in general, but we mostly do it with frogs and mosquitoes. We also have a lot of frog biting mosquitoes, and it's really interesting to see the kids trying to understand. We bring the frogs, their enemies, and they can see them in real life and understand like a lot of concepts. But I also feel that we need to continue to do that. So, for instance, and make knowledge and learning fun. So I'm a Pokemon fan, for instance.
Yeah.
So as I love Pokemon, and of course I have kids, and as my kids were playing Pokemon, I kept telling them, there is a Pokemon that does this, like, and nature, and species in nature that does this too. And my oldest at one point was like, oh, you should teach a class about this. And I'm like, oh, that would be great. And we actually co-created and developed a course, and it's called PokéBio, Pokemon Biology.
Oh my gosh.
And that was a way to get students, non-bio majors, to learn about ecology and evolution. And it was so much fun. And what we saw is that in the classes that we have taught, the students report better understanding of the content, and they love it. And the feeling of community was amazing. Like, this was a class that I'm like, so it was no grading class. Like, there were not exams, there were projects, and the students will always come. And even we did optional activities, like on a Sunday, because Pokemon has a lot of community events over the weekends.
Yeah.
And once, like, people were like, how many bonus points are you giving these students? I'm like, none. You clearly don't understand.
They just
Pokemon.
want to be here. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the main parts of the course was also communicating science. So what we did is we guided students through creating 3D Pokemon inspired by the endangered species of the Midwest. So we chose all the species that are endangered, and we learn about them. And then they created these fake mons, so that Pokemon inspires. And then we printed them relatively big. And then we had an artist from our community that came and gave them hints and explanations about, advise them on how to do 3D painting. And then we created a game on campus, and we spread them out all over campus. And our community had to go around and scan them to catch them.
Wow.
And if they scan them, there was also like a Pokemon card with all the properties of the Pokemon, and a short TikTok-like video explaining about the species, and oftentimes like their superpowers were related with their abilities in nature. And whoever collect them all, they got prizes, and we had a raffle. And it was such a success that we have expanded it, and we have done it a few times. And so far we have reached over 5,000 people in our community. Wow. And I'm just adapting it. So we will move it and start an exhibit at our local children's museum. So when kids come to the museum, they can look for the endangered Pokemon in the museum and do a little activity sheet, and then get a prize at the end. So I think that there's so many fun ways to teach people about it. And for instance, this project was originated because even when I teach biology, I teach conservation biology and I ask students, okay, tell me, I go to a committee, I'm like, tell me about endangered species. And everybody's like, the panda, the elephant. I'm like, okay, yeah. And there's actually studies that have shown that everybody goes to the charismatic megafauna.
Yes.
And I'm like, okay, now tell me about a local endangered species.
Yeah.
And people don't know.
Yeah.
And I'm a strong believer that conservation action should start local. Even though it's a global problem, we need to understand our local problems.
For sure.
So it was very rewarding to see people having fun, but also learning about endangered species that are close to us in the Midwest.
Wow.
Or right here, actually.
Yeah. No, that is so cool. I can't even conceive of a better way to get people engaged in conservation and in like animal behavior and ecology. Wow, that is awesome. I love that idea so much. And yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what you're saying. I think it's definitely our obligation as humans to care for this, this very unique world that we have. And when we zoom out and think about the cosmos as a whole, like if we're taking an astrobiology standpoint, we are so unique. I mean, like my peers and I, we like to be optimistic and believe that there is life out there, but at any rate, we are still unique. We have this world in the middle of a solar system that's fairly uninhabitable, so we think. So it's really cool that we have this and we want to protect it. And yeah, especially as, people in science or in any sort of field at all, there's always that prerogative to make sure that we can teach that to others and sort of like continue a legacy of, excitement for learning, especially in kids. And so that's just a great way to do that. And I think some people are like, oh, well, we want to make sure that kids only learn, like really like hard science. Like we don't want to like relate it to Pokémon because that's like encouraging them to like, be imaginative. It's like, yeah, well, you want people to be imaginative. Like you want kids to actually be engaged in what you're saying. So that is like the perfect way to do it.
I appreciate the words, and going onto what you were saying, something that was really interesting to me, and I collaborated with my colleagues at the College of Education, and we have studied the responses of the studies, and not only we found that there was higher cognitive performance, they felt better, like they loved the class and all of these things, and they understood the concepts better. But the other thing that was really interesting is that they felt that option of being creative was really useful. And what you were saying is interesting because when I teach my standard biology classes, I feel that I go through the generalities. Mm-hmm. So we think about what most animals are doing, because we want them to learn the general rules and all of this. The Pokemon class was so interesting because it really pushed the students to think about exceptions. Mm. And I love it because what I love about nature are like the unusual things. And sometimes they were like, well, there's a Pokemon that does this, but this seems unrealistic. Like, is there? I'm like, is it? And I'm like, well, there's actually species in the deep sea or in these really weird environments or like that's something similar. And they never get to hear about those very awesome, unique cases because we're teaching them generalities. So I think that thinking about space, maybe this is a way to think about like the amazing and unexpected forms that life can take.
Absolutely. No, for sure. That's so cool. A class that sort of pushes you to focus on exceptions. I know that in all of my biology classes, we focus on generalities, which are so fascinating, but it's even more fascinating.
We need to learn the rules, but
yes. It's always even more fascinating to think about like an organism that is an exception, that proves the rule. So that's really great. I love that, especially because our club is also focused on science communication and trying to get collaboration across boundaries. And I think the boundary between adult and child is actually one of the most important boundaries I can think of. And so like doing that outreach with the museums and making sure that children are actually excited about these topics is really important too.
Yeah, it's interesting that you call it a boundary. And I do think, well, there's a lot of developmental ontogenetic changes that are big, but I also feel that we are humans. Yeah. We are playful animals.
Yeah.
There are actually people that argue that play has really shaped who we are and our evolution. And like in this class, for instance, the first thing that we discuss is what is play and how do we recognize it in non-human animals? Mm. And I feel that we continually play. And some people feel very sophisticated and may play golf. And some people play, I know, Pokemon or Dungeons and Dragons. But we all play and we continue to do that. And I think that's our strength. So
yeah,
I think we should connect through play, learn more about through play, and motivate grown-ups to continue playing with and involving knowledge.
Yes.
And expanding their brain and boundaries of what they know.
Completely. I completely agree. That's such a cool perspective. I hope it's adopted, more and more and more. Absolutely. Okay, so another question that I want to make sure we get to is, how do organisms with super different communication styles communicate with each other, and what do they say? So is, I put in parentheses here, like, is that like, I'm gonna eat you now, or something more nuanced? Tell me if this question does not make sense, but
What do you mean by communication styles? Like, are you thinking within a same species?
I was actually thinking
different species
between different species, like trophic levels.
Okay, so when you think about when you first said styles, I thought you mean sensory modalities, because something that is amazing is that even though we have focused tremendously on visual and acoustic communication, because those are our strengths, organisms are communicating on vibrational cues, chemical cues, electricity, polarized light that we don't see, like all these different things. So, so I don't know if you mean that by styles, but what I think is interesting. Okay, and also we're like, okay, so there are all of these diverse ways of transmitting information.
Yes.
And then, for instance, in the system I work with, we were like puzzled, and we're like, okay, how does a frog, a mosquito, and a bat end up paying attention to the same signals?
Yeah. Wow.
So we're like, okay, and they're not only paying attention to the same signals, the frog calls, but they're using it also in a similar way, and they all prefer the same kind of traits on that signal.
Yeah.
So we're like, how can this come to be? And like, I'm interested, we've been looking at over evolutionary flight. When you look at flies, I'm like, how do flies started hearing frog calls? And it's something that we're still trying to understand. And in some cases, we think that it may have started as an opportunistic moment. In some cases, we know that in some species, they're using the sensory modality for communicating with conspecifics, with some individuals of the same species. And then this opens the door to hearing, eavesdropping in another species. And it's useful. Maybe with that information, you are like, okay, now I know where you are, if you're a good prey or not, you're toxic or not, and I can eat you. So there's selection to continue to refine your ability to detect that. But at the same time, and going back to how enemies have shaped communication systems, we know that some organisms have evolved private channels of communication. So they have an enemy that it's really good at detecting almost anything that they do, but then they have a signal that is produced. For instance, there's these swordtail fish that have a signal in the ultraviolet that they use for mate attraction, and yet their main predator, the tetrafish, the Mexican tetras, cannot see the ultraviolet.
Wow.
So there's sneaky ways over evolutionary time to also try to evade this. So I don't know if this answers your question or...
Totally. Yeah, no, it's definitely just a question trying to get at the nuances of the communication. And I think that's a great way to, the private channels thing is so fascinating to me. That's just amazing that, evolution has led to such sophisticated, it's a network, and it's so like complex. Yeah, that's really, really cool.
Yeah, and I hadn't thought about this in the context of life outside Earth, but thank you, Ariel, for this. You're getting me to think about it, because in sensory ecology, we think about organisms and what we have what we call the own world. And this is our own world that is basically all our sensory systems filter the information that we get and how we see the world. So, for instance, we're highly visual, but our own world is limited, but we don't detect polarized light, we don't detect the ultrasound and all of these things. But to understand how other organisms communicate, even on Earth, we need to think beyond our own perception and our own world.
Yeah.
And if we need to understand organisms outside of Earth, like probably their own world will be even
totally
shockingly different. And so that is going to stretch us to really think outside our own bubble of sensory abilities, because we are very biased and we tend to think that what we perceive is reality when it's not.
Yeah, no, you're so right. That's, I think, one of the main challenges of astrobiology is trying to look at things from a different lens, because the very first thing that you do in astrobiology is you think, what is life? What is my definition for life? And often, well, every time you come up with a definition, it's either includes too many things or too little things. And I mean, my whole thing with, it includes too many things is I tend to be skeptical of the fact that it includes too much. I wonder if there's just life that we label as non-life that actually is life. We don't really, like, who are we to necessarily say that the great red spot on Jupiter is not alive, because like it does have those like thermodynamic properties of life. So who are we to say it's not alive? But anyways, that's kind of beside the point. But you're so right. I mean, I did like a sci-fi podcast with my peer in the club, Trey, like a week ago. And we talked specifically about communication. And we sort of like connected that to different science fiction stories. And one thing is that there was a story about this octopus society where all of the octopi could communicate only their emotions to each other, and they did it through these like really complex electrical signals. And this like signaling was like on a gradient level, so instead of sort of conveying things through like granular concepts like we as humans tend to do, or at least in the English language, these octopi like convey basically any shade of their emotion with this like continuum of electrical signals, which is like crazy advanced. Like you can literally communicate to the like, it's like an infinite amount of stuff that you can communicate, which is just so cool. And something that, if we were to encounter these organisms, we probably would not have, we would be so flabbergasted, and we'd have to really be like, okay, where do we even start? Like figuring this out. Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
Indeed, and I think it is a challenge, because even if you think about it, even working with humans is hard. Yeah. Because if you want to think about how they communicate, like, I don't work in humans because I find them tremendously challenging. Yeah. I'm like, they lie, you have to be careful about the survey, like all of these things, and like what are intentions? We will lie to ourselves, like, Yeah. And then when you think about organisms that are so different from us, I love the challenge, but I also find it sometimes, overwhelming, because like, how do we understand what they're saying? What kind of information is relevant? But the good news is that we have developed so many new techniques, and now with the ability that we have to process many signals very quickly, I think we are ready to understand very complex communication systems.
For sure. I love that optimism. It's really it's really great, and I definitely like to look at things from like a glass half full perspective when it comes to these, we go from small scales like locally, and we have to be optimistic about that if we're going to actually get things done. Like, we have to be forward thinking, and then we just expand, and then we get to this giant large scale of like universal systems. And I like to think of it positively and think, maybe there is life out there, and maybe we can contact it and can build a peaceful rapport with life. And it doesn't have to be so dystopian, which, it's great when authors, go into like crazy stuff that could happen when we make contact. Like, we love being entertained by that stuff, but wouldn't it just be great if we could just have a peaceful, like, communication? Like, that would be great. Don't want to be unrealistic, but yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your participation, and this is just such an interesting interview, so thank you for lending your expertise to our podcast.
Well, thank you, and I love the interdisciplinary nature of these conversations and how you're joining fields and breaking boundaries, because I think that's where creative and novel approaches will arise. Yeah. So best of luck with this great enterprise of the club, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. Anybody who's listening, please make sure that you tune in to future episodes and let us know what you thought of this episode and what you think about different communication styles, maybe some things that were new to you that you learned today. I'm going to stop the recording now. I hope that everybody has a great day.